In this recording, we're going to be covering AP Bio Openstax Chapter 37, which is on energy flow in ecosystems, which relates to some really central concepts such as evolution and cellular respiration we've talked about all year. It's just applied in a slightly different way. So in any interspecific reaction between species, remember inter means between, like international, between countries, in any interspecific interaction, what is the goal of each species? You should be able to say indirectly to increase the chance of survival and reproduction. And often that looks like gaining or preserving energy and matter because, again, that is increasing the organism's chance to survive and reproduce. Okay, so an adaptation in terms of interactions between species that increases an organism's chance of survival and reproduction might look like gaining more energy or maintaining more energy. So obviously a prey who dies is less likely to survive because it's dead, and the predator is gaining energy, which increases its chance to survive and reproduce. When we have a symbiotic relationship, symbiosis, like down here in the bottom, where both species are benefiting, like the termites in the gut protozoa, you can see that both are benefiting. The protozoa has a habitat and gets food supplied to it, and then the termite indirectly gets food broken down after the protozoa has access to it. Deer, you can see how the deer are benefiting and how the tree is harmed, right? Because the tree is losing energy, decreasing its chance of survival. So any interactions, any animal behavior and interaction is linked to the evolutionary advantage of that behavior and interaction. All organisms must gain energy and matter in order to live and reproduce. So most of these should be familiar to you from general biology, these terms. A food chain is a linear sequence of organisms through which nutrients and energy pass from trees to deer to lion. And so you should be familiar with the terms, and from the reading, it shouldn't be complicated for you probably to understand. Primary producer, primary consumer, which consumes the primary producer. The consumers of the primary consumer are secondary consumers, and the consumers of secondary consumers are tertiary consumers. But of course we know that often this looks like a web, and often even one organism is not strictly in one trophic level. Okay, and so this is called a food web, when we have a bunch of organisms in different trophic levels interconnected with each other. The trophic level is the position of an organism that it occupies in a food web. What are the trophic levels? Again, you should be familiar with these. I'm not going to explain them in too much detail, but if you have questions, you let me know. Primary producers convert an abiotic source of energy into organic compounds. Mainly, we're thinking of photosynthesis here. This can also be chemotrophic organisms, though. Like the classic example is there are some, I don't know if they're technically plants, but there's some species at the bottom of the ocean where the tectonic plates meet that are not getting their energy through sunlight, but they are primary producers. Okay. Another term is autotrophs, and that's an organism that produces complex organic molecules using carbon from simple substances, such as carbon dioxide, usually from photosynthesis or inorganic chemical reactions like chemosynthesis. Okay. So these are, like, autotrophs are primary producers. So these are close to synonyms, at least. A photoautotroph is capable of synthesizing their own food using energy. So basically, autotrophs that use photosynthesis. Chemoautotrophs are the ones that don't use photosynthesis. Oh yes, hydrogen sulfide. I did not remember the exact compound. Here's a picture of it, where they're getting their energy from. You can look that up if you want, chemoautotrophs at the bottom of the ocean. Organisms that aren't primary producers are heterotrophs. This is an organism that cannot produce its own food, and instead it takes nutrition from other sources of organic carbon. This standard says, heterotrophs capture energy present in carbon compounds produced by other organisms, and they may metabolize carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins as sources of energy by hydrolysis. That means breaking them down into simpler compounds, which we learned about way back in like units 1 and 2, using water to break things. So AKA like cellular respiration. you're taking complex carbohydrates and other things and breaking them down into simpler chemicals. And of course, when complex high energy compounds are broken down into simpler ones, there's an energy release. That energy difference can be used to create ATP and other things the body needs for these organisms to survive and reproduce. So what are the different types of heterotrophs? Again, this should not be that foreign to you. We have primary consumers, organisms which consume primary producers. We have secondary consumers, which consume primary producers. And then there's tertiary consumers and apex. Apex, depending on the specific food web we're looking at, could be tertiary consumers, quaternary consumers, secondary consumers, something like that. Probably not higher than that because there's only so much energy that can make it all the way up. So probably, I don't even know if quaternary consumers is a common thing. I could Google that, but I feel like tertiary is probably often the highest it will go because there's just not enough energy getting transferred, which we'll talk about. Detritivores break up detritus, or the dead material, and use that for energy. And of course, they can be consumed too. So they're part of the food web as well. Aren't those beautiful butterflies? Oh, don't look at what they're eating. Oh no. So, why, again, are these organisms doing what they do? Well, again, what is the goal of these organisms? It is to survive and reproduce. And if they obtain energy more efficiently, that's helping them to survive and reproduce because they need energy to survive and they need energy to reproduce. And so each population is taking a different niche in the ecosystem, in part depicted by different organisms in different trophic levels, so they have different strategies to obtain energy to help them to survive and reproduce. Okay? Never forget that. Never, ever, ever, ever. Most energy is lost between trophic levels. So most energy does not transfer from the primary producers to the primary consumers. And so we can see if this depicts how much energy is in primary producers, only about 10% gets to primary consumers. And only 10% of that gets to secondary consumers, and only 10% of that gets to tertiary consumers. Okay? Which is why, environmentally speaking, if you have more primary producers in your diet, you're usually being more environmentally friendly. So eating meat a lot is actually a little bit less environmentally friendly. Now, I'm not a nutritionist, and I'm not here to make a nutritionist argument, okay? And by the way, I'm not a vegetarian. Everyone wants to meat every once in a while, and that's perfectly fine. But there also is the scientific fact that if we're eating meat all the time, regardless of, I'm not going to delve into how much meat is too much meat and what's a good diet, although it probably wouldn't hurt most people to eat more salad. But there is an environmental cost as well. If we have meat every meal or something, it's actually a little less environmentally friendly because it uses a lot of energy to produce primary consumers or secondary consumers, which is where the meat is coming from, as opposed to primary producers. So it's less energy efficient to eat meat than it is to eat primary consumers. Which is just something to consider when we're considering how to sustain a population and a group of people and what is responsible eating and all that. And that's complicated, right? And also different, within a trophic level, different primary consumers are less efficient than others. So you could look up this video, Why I Eat Bugs, by a common science YouTuber. And for example, eating bugs is actually a lot more efficient than eating a cow or something like that, in terms of the amount of water needed and the amount of food needed to provide, how much food that you provide to the organism. Because for a cow, you're feeding them a lot of corn. So what percentage of the energy intake is actually making it onto the person eating the cow? It's not very much. For a bug, it's actually more. But of course, this gets into cultural stuff too. Here in West Africa, anywhere I've been, if you invite someone over, you got to give them meat. It would almost be an offense to not, at least on my understanding. But at the same time, when I was in Niger, they ate crickets. And that's, technically more environmentally friendly. So whereas like where I'm from in America, nah, people ain't eating bugs. But I've never been to Asia in my life, but from what I hear, a lot of countries in Asia are less perturbed by this idea of eating bugs, which environmentally speaking is good. So what is entropy? What is entropy? Hopefully you remember from your general biology or your general chemistry or earlier in the year that entropy is a measure of the disorder. And another way we think about it, another aspect of entropy is due to increasing disorder that is always happening in any process, energy is always being lost. And what is metabolism? Well, we can think about metabolism as a series of chemical processes. So like, for example, cellular respiration. So in any chemical process like cellular respiration, there is energy always being lost. Or in photosynthesis, there's energy always being lost. And the conservation of energy tells us that the total amount of energy in the universe is constant. Organisms must obtain energy and convert it into forms that allow them to do work. They can't create energy on their own. They must obtain it from somewhere. But the second law of how energy works, which relates to entropy, is that some energy in any process is lost as heat. And also, things always degrade and become less ordered over time. They become more disordered. So it takes energy to keep things ordered. Hence, you need energy every day to maintain your body, because due to entropy, your body would fall out of homeostasis. So you need energy to maintain your body. But that process as well of maintaining your body, the input of energy, a lot of that energy is lost. So like, for example, cellular respiration, about a third, when you are performing cellular respiration, about a third of the energy is actually used as ATP. And the other 2/3 is released as heat. And this helps explain human body temperature. Okay, so organisms that maintain their own body temperature, which actually, if we scroll down here to the very end of the slides, if we're talking about like endotherms, which are organisms that maintain their body temperature through their own chemical processes, a lot of the energy used to maintain a body temperature, like in humans, is actually through cellular respiration. Just the energy released as a result of the inefficiency of that process. And here's just an example showing you what entropy is. Entropy is a measure of the disorder or randomness in a system. And so, for example, if we're going to more disordered state, there's an increase in entropy. Again, you should hopefully be familiar already with what entropy is. Okay? And so any organism needs to go through processes of metabolism. And again, metabolism is all the chemical reactions that take place inside the cells, including those that use energy and those that release energy. And where does the energy come from for these metabolic processes, such as photosynthesis, such as cellular respiration, such as any chemical process that needs to occur in any organism anywhere around the world? Where does that energy come from? Ultimately, except for those, small example of the chemo autotrophs at the bottom of the ocean that aren't getting their energy from the source, it is the sun. Okay? The sun is the source of energy because it's where the primary producers in photosynthesis get their energy, and that's what the consumers use, and then consumers of consumers are still indirectly getting their energy from that. We could consider like a grazing food web where things are eating plants and then they are consumed. You could also consider detrital food web because these detritivores, these decomposers, are also consumed by other things, and then that releases energy as well. So energy, we can remember in regards to entropy that energy is always lost as heat. And in the course of cellular respiration, yes, you make ATP, but actually most of the energy is lost. And in photosynthesis, yes, the plants make glucose, which can be made into cellulose or energy that they need for their chemical processes, like it can make ATP, right, through cellular respiration that they do. Because remember the whole idea, like in general bio, if you had me for general bio, I yell at you and say that the tree doesn't care about you. And the whole point of that is that the tree doesn't do photosynthesis for you. The tree does photosynthesis for itself because it helps it survive and reproduce, right? Because we get this idea that like the tree is like, you know, you get this elementary idea like, oh, the tree cares for you. Look, it's making oxygen for you. No, the tree does photosynthesis to make glucose, which it can use to make its own body mass, like cellulose, or it can use the glucose for its cellular respiration to power its own processes. Now, that's the scientific explanation, right? Now, we can say that, like, from a theological perspective, God provides us with the trees, and that's also true. But you got to also understand that scientifically speaking, the tree is not doing it out of a care or concern for you. The tree is getting its own energy through photosynthesis, right? So if a plant, like let's say you're farming onions, okay? If you're farming onions, most of the energy that onion gets from the sun is not making it to you. First of all, most of the sunlight that hits the onion is not staying in the onion. And then what goes into the onion, most of it is used in the onion's cellular respiration. Only some of it is actually increasing the onion's body mass, which then you can take and eat some of that and get some of the energy from that, and then only some of the energy that you even eat is actually going to make ATP through cellular respiration. So you can see there's a lot of points at which energy are lost here. And so we can see this shows you in each step, there's a ton of energy lost as heat and through cellular respiration. So gross productivity says how much energy in total is being like captured at each step. And then net productivity is saying how much energy is actually still there after we account for what the plant is using in cellular respiration. So you can see, look at all that darn energy that's hitting the onions. Okay, all the energy hitting those onions. And out of that 1,700,000 kilocalories per meter squared per year, the onions are only actually gathering 20,000 of it. Yeah, I'm sorry. They do their best, guys, but, you know, it's just limited. But then they're using like 2/3 of that for their own cellular respiration. Because again, as I tell you, like the plants, they're not thinking, oh, I really got to help. I really got to help my friend Sally today so I can grow big and strong so she can eat me. No, that is right. We can explain it through the plant is gaining energy so it can survive and reproduce. And the onion is not thinking, at least I don't think the onion has conscious thoughts that it's, you know, feeding itself, but it's using that energy. And then what's remaining is going into onion biomass. And only that is what you can then take and eat. And then most of that gets lost and doesn't even make it to ATP from cellular respiration in you. So there's a lot of energy lost at every step, and that goes down every trophic level. Let's go ahead and pause this video and see if you can answer this question. You should have paused this video, and then you should have seen when you unpause the video that the answer is going to be D. Energy can only come from primary producers. There is no other source of the energy. Okay, so biomass is the total mass in a unit area at the time of measurement of living or previously living organisms within a trophic level. Gross primary productivity is the amount of chemical energy, typically expressed as carbon biomass, that primary producers create in a given length of time. So it's like the total energy that they are being able to incorporate from the sun, okay? It's the total energy they're going to incorporate. What molecules produced by photosynthesis for energy storage? Come on, guys. Glucose, right? What molecules used for immediate energy use? Glucose, right? Glucose is made from photosynthesis. Glucose is used in cellular respiration. Hopefully you know that by now. Okay, so photosynthesis is the process by which plants or other photoautotrophs take carbon dioxide and water and energy from the sun to make glucose and oxygen. But again, most of that energy is not actually used as stored biomass. Most of it will be used in cellular respiration. Net primary productivity is the energy that remains in the producers after accounting for respiration and heat loss, aka accounting for their own cellular respiration and other chemical inefficiencies, okay? And so the difference between the gross and the net is quite large. There's, as you showed in that previous one, for example, in that example diagram, the gross was like 20,000, but the net was like 7,000. So energy used for respiration or given off as heat is not available to consumers. And so if energy is obtained by an organism, if energy obtained by an organism is not used for respiration or released as heat, then where is it? It's stored as biomass. And so energy from cellular respiration is also used to create and manipulate other organic molecules. So this energy is stored as biomass, but it's not necessarily all glucose. It can be converted into polysaccharides or lipids and manipulated into all sorts of compounds, proteins, etc., right? All the biomass is coming indirectly through cellular respiration. If you recall back when we talked about cellular respiration, I showed this graph, and it showed that there's all these, for example, in the human body, there's all these chemical processes that are connected to some step of cellular respiration, and they feed into each other. And so there's all sorts of chemical processes in terms of different types of biomolecules being made that are linked to taking intermediates from cellular respiration. This relates to the basic principle of gaining or losing weight. If you maintain a steady weight, then your net energy gain is zero. A net gain in energy results in energy storage. A net loss of energy results in loss of mass. So like the onion, it's gaining mass. That is the energy storage that it is not using for cellular respiration and is not lost as heat. So out of the total energy it's obtaining through the glucose made in photosynthesis, what is actually stored as biomass we can think of as like the net energy stored. And again, remember from back when we talked about cellular respiration in units 1, 2, and 3, that all sorts of energy can be converted into different types of energy. So you could, this gives an example of how fat can be broken down, or sugar can be taken and converted into fat, right? So if you see, fat-free Jell-O, that means I can eat as much as I want and I'll never get fat. Like get fat is in like gain fat in your body. I'm not speaking to like, I don't know if that's clear. That's very confusing wording. But no, you can eat sugar-free, you can eat fat-free Jell-O and yet create more fat cells in your body by eating fat-free Jell-O, because your body can convert the glucose in the Jell-O into the fats, the lipids stored in your fat cells, right? Those different types of molecules can be converted into each other, and that is all linked to the systems of cellular respiration and how cellular respiration is linked to all sorts of metabolic processes in the body. Why will net primary productivity always be less than gross primary productivity? Because energy is always lost as, well, you should be able to answer this. Pause it, answer this to yourself. Energy is always lost as heat, and the organism is using a lot of energy in cellular respiration. What's left over is stored as body mass. So net consumer productivity is the energy available to consumers of the next trophic level once they eat it, once they eat the thing from the level above. And so the measurement of energy transfer efficiency between two successive trophic levels is the production at the present trophic level over the production at the previous trophic level times 1%. In other words, how much energy in this trophic level over the previous trophic level. This is roughly about 10%. So in each trophic level, 90%-ish of the energy is lost, and only 10% makes it into the next trophic level. Here are some examples. Every time you go up in trophic level, most of the energy is lost. Most of the energy doesn't make it from the trophic level below. Let's go ahead and pause this video and see if you can answer this question. Okay, you should have paused this video and answered this question, and you should get the answer is C. Because there will always be, as energy will always be found at the base, and there is loss and not gain as you're going up in trophic levels. Energy is always lost. Why aren't there infinite trophic levels? Go ahead and pause this video and answer that to yourself. You should say, because energy is always lost, so you can't keep going. Okay, it's gonna run out. Okay, so some factors influencing how much energy an organism needs. Well, we have endotherms and ectotherms. So endotherms maintain their body temperature, largely by the use of heat set free by its internally body functions, such as cellular respiration. And ectotherms are an organism in which the internal sources of heat are relatively small or quite negligible, and so they rely on the environment instead of producing their own energy, okay? Which allows them, they have to rely on the environment to maintain their body temperature for their enzymes, etc., to function, but they don't have to use as much cellular respiration in order to maintain their body temperature, and so they can use less energy. So like a lizard can stay still for a really long time because it's an ectotherm. So it doesn't have to be moving around to maintain its body temperature. It can lie in the sun and get its energy from that. So endotherms maintain their body temperature at a constant level, whereas ectotherms, it varies, okay? But even ectotherms need to, of course, keep it at a certain level in order to live, right? You can't put a lizard in Antarctica because the lizard will die because its enzymes won't be at the right temperature for them to work properly. Okay, so this is an example of what we've been talking about, so you can read these. Take a moment to read slide 74, and then unpause. Now take a moment to read slide 75, and then unpause and see if you can answer this. Which of the following is not correct? Okay, hopefully you're able to pause and answer this. And you should have D, same trophic level. Cow and crickets are on the same trophic level. They're both primary consumers, so tried to trick you up there. But crickets, not trickets. Crickets are more environmentally friendly nonetheless. So metabolic rate is the baseline metabolic rate of an animal is measured as the basal metabolic rate, BMR, for an endotherm, or as the standard metabolic rate, SMR, for an ectotherm. They are measures of the metabolic rate in animals that are at rest, calm, and not actively digesting food. In other words, how much energy do they have to use just to stay alive? And for an endotherm, it's a lot more because the endotherm needs to use cellular respiration in order to provide its own energy. Okay, it's like mini fires in all your cells all the time, providing the heat that you need to maintain your body temperature. Whereas a lizard doesn't need to do that. It's getting its heat from the sun that is right there. Okay, and so another fun fact is that smaller organisms have a way higher metabolic rates per body mass than larger organisms. Why? Well, we don't really know, but I want you to read this article to have them tell you that we don't really know why, but to give you a general synopsis of some ideas, etc. We also talk about this a little bit in physics, how it might be related to surface area versus volume of smaller organisms versus larger organisms, but it's still up for debate. Okay, so what was the key takeaway from here? The key takeaway is you should hopefully remember the different trophic levels from your general biology and the reading, that there should not be new information from you, and that you should understand the adaptations and different organisms gaining energy in terms of their in terms of increasing their ability to survive and reproduce, which is an evolutionary driven process. And you should also understand that most of the energy is lost going up in trophic levels due to it being used in cellular respiration and lost as heat. Okay, those are the main takeaways from chapter 37. Hopefully you got that.